Karen's heart was pounding, and she longed to take him back, but she remained silent. At the end of the dance, Vandermeer claimed Tristan's attention for the neighboring sheepmen. Karen walked alone through the spacious living room, passing by one of the porch doors. A voice spoke to her from the shadows. "Hey, beautiful eyes!" She felt a chill run down her spine, but didn't acknowledge the speaker. She knew who it was and recognized the crude comment. Karen made her way to the other side of the room where a group of people were gathered. She casually glanced at the door and noticed several men hanging around, including Hayes Ruff, the sheep dipper. His bold eyes were fixed on her, and his face wore a knowing smile, as if he understood something about her that others didn't. Karen avoided eye contact and tried to ignore the feeling that this man's gaze was following her every move. The incident would have been unremarkable if Karen could have forgotten about it. However, she couldn't shake off the sense of discomfort caused by this ruffian's attention. She tried to convince herself that she was just the center of attention, but Ruff's tone and look were different from anything she had experienced before. Karen briefly considered telling Tristan, but knew it would only lead to a fight, so she kept quiet. She danced, helped Joyce entertain her guests, and passed by the door often. Once she even stood before it deliberately, driven by the strange and inexplicable impulses of a woman. Despite it all, she couldn't escape the feeling of discomfort caused by Ruff's boldness. It slowly dawned on Karen that what made Ruff's behavior so different from other men's was his assumption that she enjoyed his attention. The fool's smile seemed to suggest that he thought she was secretly thrilled by his advances. Karen had encountered many types of male egotism before, but Ruff's was beyond anything she had ever seen. After the party ended and the guests left, Karen forgot about the man and the incident. The next day, Joyce rode in from down the canyon and called out to Karen to come down from the porch. Karen rushed down the stairs to meet her. Joyce was covered in dust and smelled of sheep dip. She had been to Ryan's camp and had ridden hard to beat Tristan home. Joyce wanted to tell Karen something that Tristan had sworn her not to tell. She complained that Tristan thinks Karen can't handle things. Karen asked if Tristan was hurt, and Joyce replied that he was skinned and bruised, but not hurt. When Karen asked what happened, Joyce revealed that Tristan had fought Hayes Ruff. Karen was shocked and asked if Joyce had seen the fight. Joyce replied that she had, and that she enjoys fights almost as much as horse races. Joyce scolded Karen for not telling her that Ruff had insulted her the night before. Karen explained that Ruff had only said, "Hello, pretty eyes," and she had let it go. Joyce warned Karen not to let things slide in Arizona because things would only get worse. Joyce had heard about the incident from Charlie, who overheard Ruff speaking to Karen the night before. Charlie liked Karen and hated Ruff, so he may have exaggerated the situation. "He really made Tristan mad," exclaimed Joyce, "and let me tell you, Karen, you missed the best thing that's happened since you got here." Karen's face flushed with anticipation. "What happened?" she begged. Joyce began to recount the events of the day, her modernized language flowing smoothly. "I rode over to Ryan's place to get Dad, and when I got there I had no idea what Ruff had said to you. Dad didn't know either. Tristan hadn't arrived yet. Just as the men were finishing dipping the sheep, Tristan came riding down, fast as lightning." "What's wrong with Tristan?" asked Dad, standing up from his seat. "I knew Tristan was angry, but I've never seen him like that before. He looked really grim and dark. He rode straight towards us and got off his horse. Dad and I yelled at him, but Tristan made his way to the sheep pen." Joyce continued with her tale. "You know where we watched Hayes Ruff and Lorenzo slinging the sheep into the dip. Ruff was just about to climb out over the fence when Tristan jumped up on it. 'Say, Ruff,' he said sternly, 'Charlie and Ben told me they heard you speak disrespectfully to Miss Oakman last night.' Dad and I ran to the fence, but before we could catch hold of Tristan, he had jumped down into the pen." "I don't care much for what those herders say," replied Ruff. "Do you deny it?" demanded Tristan. "I ain't denying nothing, Mitterwald," growled Ruff. "I might argue against me being disrespectful. That's a matter of opinion." "You'll apologize for speaking to Miss Oakman, or I'll beat you up and have Vandermeer fire you," warned Tristan. "Well, Mitterwald, I never eat my words," replied Ruff. And with that, Tristan knocked Ruff flat on the ground. The sound echoed through the air like a club hitting a steer. "Look out, Tristan, he packs a gun," yelled Dad. Ruff got up, seething with anger. Then they began to fight. Ruff swung at Tristan but missed his face. Tristan retaliated by hitting Ruff in the face repeatedly. Ruff became bloody and cursed. Tristan continued to beat him against the fence until Ruff reached for a weapon. The men and I yelled as Tristan knocked Ruff into a poisonous ditch. Ruff floundered and crawled out blinded. One of the men led him to a pond to wash off the poison. Tristan warned Ruff that a bullet would be worse than the poison. Later on, Karen went for a ride on a Mustang lent to her by Joyce. She had improved her horsemanship and felt the difference in riding with a different horse. This Mustang was of Navajo stock and was born and raised at Lost Mule. Karen had no issues with him and arranged to meet Tristan after his work. He was fond of the same things she was, but above all he loved to ride. His coat resembled a calico pattern, and following Western tradition he was named Calico. Left to his own pace, Calico always settled into a gentle, swinging stride that Karen never grew tired of. Even better, he didn't spook at anything in the road, darting rabbits or the fluttering of birds. Karen had grown attached to Calico before she even realized it. For Karen to care for anything or anyone was a serious matter because it didn't happen often and it lasted. She was fiercely loyal. June was almost over and summer had settled into the barren land. Karen had never experienced such perfect, wonderful weather before. The mornings were cool, fresh, fragrant, and sweet, with a breeze that felt like it came from heaven. The air was full of the sound of falling water and the melody of mockingbirds. At noon, the great white sun beat down so hard it burned the skin, yet somehow the burn felt pleasant. The waning afternoons were Karen's particular torment when everything seemed to be winding down, seeking rest, and life softened into a mindless happiness. These hours troubled Karen because she wanted them to last, but she knew that this changing and transforming time could not last forever. As long as she didn't think about it, she was content. The maples, sycamores, and oaks were in full foliage, and their bright green colors contrasted softly with the dark shine of the pines. The amber water of the creek gleamed through the spaces between the brown tree trunks and the white-spotted holes of the sycamores. Little rills murmured and little rapids dashed musically. Trout leaped out of the still, shady pools, creating ever-widening ripples on the surface. The green banks were adorned with Indian paintbrush, adding a touch of fire to the landscape. Under the oaks, in cool, dark nooks where mossy boulders lined the stream, stately, nodding yellow columbines could be seen. High on the rock ledges, the wonderful mescal stalks shot up, beginning to blossom, some with tints of gold and others with tones of red. Karen rode along down the canyon under its looming walls, wondering if she had underestimated the physical aspects of Arizona. This thought had crossed her mind before, but she always fought it and denied it by eliminating it. However, she knew that refusing to acknowledge something ever-present was not a long-term solution. The thought could take hold of her insensibly and subtly, never to be broken. Yet it was much easier to dream than to think. She realized that it was not a dreamful habit of mind she had fallen into of late. When she dreamed or mused, she lived vaguely and sweetly over past happy hours or dwelt in enchanted fancy upon a possible future. A Columbia professor had told Karen that she was a modern young woman of materialistic mind. Regardless, she knew that many things seemed to be loosening from the narrowness and tightness of her character, exposing a new and strange and susceptible softness of fiber. This blank habit of mind, when she did not think and now realized that she was not dreaming, seemed to be the body of Karen Oakman, and her heart and soul stripped of a shell. Nerve and emotion and spirit received something from her surroundings. She absorbed her environment. She felt it was a delightful state. But when her own consciousness caused it to elude her, then she both resented and regretted. Karen knew that she would not be able to avoid the harsh and unforgiving environment of the West forever. However, she refused to become permanently attached to this crude and uninhabited land. Despite her initial reluctance, Karen had to admit that living in the West had improved her health, invigorated her senses, and made her former homes in Florida and the Adirondacks seem insignificant in comparison. As she rode through the rugged terrain, Karen couldn't help but ponder the words of her friend Tristan. He always insisted that it was the hardships and challenges of the West that made living there worthwhile. However, Karen could not understand his perspective. 5 miles south of West Fork, Karen turned onto a narrow and treacherous road that wound its way up the side of a steep canyon. Although the climb was difficult and the road was full of rocks and ruts, Karen preferred going up to coming back down. Once she reached the top of the canyon, Karen was met with a blistering hot wind that blew sand and dust into her face. She searched her pockets for her goggles, but realized that she had forgotten them. The wind was so punishing that Karen could hardly stand it. Karen knew that she had to continue riding, even though she was riding against a fierce gale. She was supposed to meet Tristan somewhere along the first few miles of the road, and if she turned back for any reason, he would worry about her. As she rode on, the wind grew stronger and more persistent. Karen found herself in a barren and desolate landscape, devoid of any vegetation except for a few cedars and bushes. In the distance, she saw a cloud of yellow dust rising high into the sky. The dust storm was barreling towards Karen on the wings of a fierce gale. She recalled a log cabin that had saved her and Joyce from a rainstorm before, somewhere along this flat. It didn't seem likely that she had passed it yet, so she braced herself to find it. Karen would have welcomed any shelter from the hard, dusty gusts, but there was nothing to be found. When the wind hit her hard enough, she had to shut her eyes to protect them. In brief moments of calm, she searched through the yellow haze for the cabin. The alkali dust filled her eyes, making them sting and smart. The stronger gusts carried pebbles that hurt her, and the dust clogged her nose and mouth. The heat was like a blast furnace, causing her to sweat and cake the dust on her face. Despite her discomfort, Karen felt a thrill in being responsible for herself. She could hate the obstacle, but still feel pride in overcoming it. After another mile of battling the gale, Karen was nearly panic-stricken and ready to turn back. Just as she was about to give up, she spotted the cabin through the flying dust. Karen tied her Mustang to a post and entered the cabin, relieved to have found refuge. She knew that when Tristan arrived, she would have another feat to add to her already impressive list. Karen wiped away the dust from her eyes with her handkerchief, tears streaming down her face. She soon realized she needed soap, hot water, and a towel to clean the dust from her face. The cabin was filled with a soft rustling sound that came and went. Karen went to the door and saw that the dust storm was passing by, the yellow pall moving northward. The sun was sinking in the west, a strange magenta color. "I knew I was going to get hit," Karen said to herself wearily as she sat down on a rough couch made of poles. She was dirty, tired, and feeling depressed. She waited for Tristan, feeling relieved when she heard the clip-clop of hooves. "There he is, that's Tristan," she exclaimed, running to the door. She saw a big bay horse with a burly rider. The rider saw her at the same time and pulled his horse. "Ho, ho, if it isn't Pretty Eyes!" he shouted in a rough, raspy voice. Karen recognized the voice and the man as Hayes Ruff. She was shocked and stunned. "Well, well, what luck?" he said, dismounting. "I knew we'd meet someday. I didn't exactly come looking for you, but I kept my eyes open." He clearly knew she was alone, as he didn't look into the cabin. "I'm waiting for Tristan," Karen said, trying to keep her lips stiff. "Of course, I figured as much," he replied in a friendly tone. "He won't be here for a while," he said with a cheerful tone that made it seem like the news would please her. He wore a smile that stretched across his rugged face. Without being too rude, he pushed her back into the cabin and stepped inside. "How dare you!" Karen cried out. She felt a hot anger stirring inside her, but it quickly dissipated, leaving her feeling cold and shaken. The man in front of her was huge and monstrous, with an uncouth and brawny presence that terrified her. His devilishly intelligent and keen eyes glittered with hard, glinting twinkle, and his knowing smile only made him appear more brutal and physically intimidating. Just the sight of him was enough to make Karen feel terrified. "Me? Oh, I'm a daring man and quite the ladies' man," he said, laughing loudly. Karen couldn't seem to gather her thoughts. The moment he pushed her back into the cabin and followed her, she felt shocked and almost paralyzed. Even if she wanted to fight back, she couldn't seem to find the strength. "Let me out of here," she demanded. "Nope. I'm going to make a little love to you," he said, reaching out with his large, hairy hands. Karen could see the strength in those hands that had easily swung the sheep, but they were also dirty and greasy, making her flesh crawl. "Tristan will kill you," she gasped. "Why?" he asked, feigning surprise. "Oh, I know women. You'll never tell him." "Yes, I will." "Well, maybe, but I think you're lying, Pretty Eyes," he replied with a grin. "Either way, I'm willing to take the chance." "I'm telling you he'll kill you," Karen repeated, backing away until she felt her weak knees hit the couch. "Why would he do that?" he demanded. "For this insult," Karen said, pointing at him. Huh. I'd like to know who insulted you. Can't a man show a little affection without offending a lady? Ruff asked, looking at Karen with a cocky grin. Karen was confused. What are you talking about? She asked. That white shimmy dress you wore to Joyce's party, Ruff said. That's my invitation to get close to you, pretty eyes. Karen was speechless. His words had a strange power over her. If it wasn't an invitation, what was it? Ruff asked, taking a step closer to her. Karen didn't answer. You're turning pale, Ruff said, mocking her. I thought you were tougher than that. Come here. He grabbed her coat and pulled her towards him. Karen was so overwhelmed by his strength that she lost her breath. He wrapped his other arm around her, crushing her senses. Suddenly, he pushed her away with force, and she fell onto the couch, hitting her head against the wall. If you're going to faint, I'm out, Ruff said, disgusted. Can't you Eastern women handle anything? Karen opened her eyes and saw Ruff looking down at her with disappointment. You look like a sick kitten, he said. When I get a girlfriend or wife, I want her to be a wildcat. Karen was relieved by his scorn. She sat up, trying to regain her composure. Did you think I was going to hurt you? Ruff asked gruffly. I was afraid, Karen admitted. It was a strange feeling, but she was grateful for the release. Well, I reckon I wouldn't have hurt you. None of these flop-over Janes for me. And I'll give you a hint, pretty eyes. You might have run across a fella that was no gentleman. This statement was the most remarkable thing Karen had ever heard. What did you wear that unnatural white dress for? He demanded, as if he had the right to judge her. Unnatural? Echoed Karen. Sure, that's what I said. Any woman's dress without top or bottom is unnatural. It's not right. Why, you looked like, he floundered for adequate expression, like one of the devil's angels. And I want to hear why you wore it. For the same reason I'd wear any dress, she felt forced to reply. Pretty eyes, that's a lie. And you know it's a lie. You wore that white dress to knock the daylights out of men. Only you aren't honest enough to say so. Even me or my kind. Even us who are dirt under your little feet. But all the same, we're men, and maybe better men than you think. If you had to put that dress on, why didn't you stay in your room? No, you had to come down and strut around and show off your beauty. And I ask you, if you're a nice girl like Joyce Vandermeer, what did you wear it for? Karen not only was mute, she felt rise and burn in her a singular shame and surprise. I'm only a sheep-dipper, went on Ruff. But I ain't no fool. A fella doesn't have to live east and wear swell clothes to have sense. Maybe you'll learn that the West is bigger than you think. A man's a man, east or west. But if your Eastern men stand for such dresses as that white one, they'd do well to come out west a while, like your lover, Tristan Mitterwald. After 10 years of rustling around these parts, I ain't never seen a dress like yours before, and I ain't never heard of no girl getting insulted neither. Maybe you think I insulted you, but I didn't, 'cause I reckon nothing could insult you in that dress. And here's my last hunch, pretty eyes. You ain't what a guy like me would call square a game. Adios. With that, his bulky figure darkened the doorway and passed out, letting the light of the sky stream back into the cabin. Karen sat there staring, still in shock. She heard the tinkle of Ruff's spurs, the ring of steel on stirrup, and the sound of his mount as he rode away, his hooves pounding rapidly and then fading into the distance. He was gone, and she felt relieved that she had escaped something raw and violent. But she was still under the deadening influence of shock. This raw experience was the worst the West had dealt her, and it brought back former states of revulsion and formed them into one whole, irrefutable and damning judgment that seemed to blot out the vaguely dawning and growing happy susceptibilities. It was perhaps just as well to have her mind reverted to realistic fact. The presence of Hayes Ruff, the astounding truth of the contact with his huge, sheep-defiled hands, had been profanation and degradation under which she sickened with fear and shame. Yet hovering back of her shame and rising anger seemed to be a pale, monstrous, and indefinable thought, insistent and accusing, with which she must sooner or later reckon. It might have been the voice of the new side of her nature, but at that moment of outraged womanhood and revolt against the West, she would not listen. It might, too, have been the still small voice of conscience. With a sudden burst of determination, Karen shook off her emotional and perplexed state of mind and composed herself before Tristan arrived. The dust had settled, but the wind still blew strongly. The sun had set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Karen spotted a horseman in the distance and recognized him as Tristan. Without hesitation, she mounted her Mustang and rode out to meet him, not wanting to wait for him at the cabin where he might notice tracks other than her own. Tristan arrived quickly and greeted her with relief. "Hello, I sure was worried," he said, extending his gloved hand. "Did you run into that sandstorm?" Karen laughed and replied, "It ran into me, Tristan, and buried me." He looked at her with a warm and loving gaze, noticing her fear and apprehension. "Well, under all that dust you look scared," he said. "Scared? I was worse than that. When I first ran into the flying dirt, I was only afraid I'd lose my way and my complexion. But when the worst of the storm hit me, then I feared I'd lose my breath." Tristan asked if she had ridden through the entire storm, to which Karen replied, "No, not all, but enough. I went through the worst of it before I reached the cabin." Tristan wrapped his long arm around her and pulled her close, a rare display of affection. Despite Karen losing her footing in the saddle, she welcomed his embrace. He kissed her dusty face before pulling away. "By George, Karen, sometimes I think you've changed since you've been here," he said with warmth. "I can't believe we made it through that sandstorm without a single problem," Tristan said with a hint of admiration in his voice. Karen, trying to hide her excitement at being praised by him, replied, "I always think of what Joyce says. The worst is yet to come." "Karen Oakman, you don't know yourself," Tristan declared enigmatically. "What woman truly knows herself? But do you know me?" "I'm not sure I do," Karen admitted. "But sometimes I see depths in you, wonderful possibilities hidden beneath your calm exterior." Tristan smiled wryly. "You think I have potential. As a boy, I had big dreams and aspirations. But like so many others, I got caught up in the trappings of modern life. We live for pleasure and luxury, forgetting our responsibilities to ourselves and those around us." Karen looked at him with concern. "Tristan, you distress me when you talk like this. You used to be so hopeful and optimistic. It seems like you're bitter against women." Tristan shook his head. "No, Karen, I'm only sad. I see now where once I was blind. American women are the best in the world, but they are in danger of extinction if they don't change, according to Tristan." Karen, however, didn't agree with him and asked how he could say that. Tristan then asked Karen how many of her friends have children, and Karen was surprised to realize that very few of them were even married, and only 3 had babies. Karen tried to defend her gender, saying that women have to find husbands, but they are not easy to come by these days. The high cost of living is also a factor, and many apartment buildings do not accept children. Tristan, however, did not blame women more than men, but instead urged everyone to read the signs of the times and meet the crisis in an American way. Money should not become God in America, or we will suffer the same fate as Rome. Despite Karen's plea to end the argument, Tristan continued to express his concern for the future of the American race. "Don't worry, I'm not afraid of you," Karen said, trying to ease the tension. Tristan agreed. "Yeah, we should head back. We're still a good 6 or 7 miles from home." Karen had recently become proud of her ability to ride fast with Tristan. She urged her Mustang to keep up with his horse as they rode towards the canyon. The wind rushing past her and the feeling of flying through the air exhilarated her. She had worked hard to learn how to ride like a true Westerner, and Tristan complimented her on her skill. As they rode, Karen's thoughts turned to the contradictions in her feelings towards the West. She loved the thrill of riding through the rugged terrain, but at the same time she hated the harshness of the land. She couldn't deny, however, that the West had saved the life of her future husband, and she was grateful for that. As they reached the edge of the canyon, the early twilight cast a purple glow over the landscape. Karen couldn't help but admire the beauty of the evening star and the sound of the stream below. She knew she had problems to solve, but for the moment she was content to just enjoy the moment. As they descended into the green forested canyon, Tristan asked Karen if she loved it. "Yes, I love the ride and you," she replied, knowing he meant the canyon's brooding solitude. "But I love New York," she added, emphasizing her faithfulness. Tristan, undeterred, urged Karen to love Arizona, but she stood firm. He brushed her cheek with his lips, then spurred his horse and challenged her to a race. "That Mustang and Joyce have beaten me many a time. Come on." Karen was roused by his tone and look. Was he resentful of her loyalty to New York? Did he think Joyce could catch him if Karen couldn't? It was absurd, but it spurred her to recklessness. She urged her Mustang to run, and soon they were racing down the soft yellow road flanked by green foliage and pines. Tristan's big steed was impressive, but Karen saw the distance between them diminishing. Calico, her little Mustang, was overtaking the bay. She cried out in excitement as Tristan urged his horse to greater speed. Still, he couldn't draw away from Calico. Karen felt as though riding him required no effort at all. With the wind rushing past her ears and the green walls of the forest blurring together in her vision, Karen felt an exhilarating sense of freedom. The stinging sensation of pine needles on her cheeks and neck only added to the thrill of the moment. As she closed in on Tristan, his horse's hooves kicked up damp sand and gravel, covering Karen's riding habit and splattering her face. She had to shield her eyes with her hand, causing her to lose some of her confidence and balance in the saddle. Despite her inexperience, Karen refused to let her fear or awkwardness slow down the magnificent Mustang she was riding. Calico seemed to understand the situation, and he was determined to catch and pass the big bay horse. As they drew even with Tristan, Karen let out a triumphant cry. Calico surged ahead of the bay horse, but his movements became jerky and uncontrolled. Karen struggled to maintain her balance as they rushed through the forest, the wind whipping past her face. Suddenly, Calico stumbled, and Karen was thrown from the saddle, crashing to the ground with a jarring impact that left her unconscious. As Karen regained consciousness, she felt a heavy weight on her chest and a numbing sensation all over her body. When she opened her eyes, she saw Tristan leaning over her with a wet and cold handkerchief on her face. He seemed hopeful and exclaimed, "Karen, you can't be hurt, really. It was just a spill and you landed on the sand. You can't be hurt." Karen noticed the look in his eyes and the tone of his voice, which made her want to pretend to be badly hurt just to get more from Tristan. However, she knew that she was only bruised and scraped. She whispered to him, "Tristan, dear, I think my back is broken. You'll be free soon." Tristan was taken aback and turned pale. He stuttered and couldn't speak properly. Karen couldn't bear to see him like that, but she needed to know if he truly loved her. She closed her eyes and felt his presence, which was immensely comforting. Suddenly, Karen decided to reveal the truth. She flung her arms around Tristan's neck and exclaimed, "Oh, Tristan, it was too good a chance to miss. I'm not hurt a bit." Karen felt overjoyed at the realization that Tristan loved her deeply, and nothing could change that. Chapter 7. One day, Karen asked Mrs. Vandermeer if she could make a nice lunch for her and Tristan. She planned to surprise him at his farm where he was working. Mrs. Vandermeer thought it was a great idea and quickly went to prepare the lunch. Karen soon found herself carrying a basket filled with food, setting out on an adventure that left her feeling both excited and anxious. From the moment Karen laid eyes on Tristan's work, she was captivated. His strength and ability to do such labor made her proud, and the thought of him continuing to do so left her pondering and brooding. The morning was reminiscent of a rare June day in the east, with the air saturated by a thick amber light. However, the sun beat down harder here, while the shade was cooler. Karen followed the trail below, where West Fork poured its golden-green waters into Lost Mule. The red walls of the canyon appeared to dream and wait under the sun's blaze, and the heat lay like a blanket over the still foliage. The birds were silent, and only the murmuring stream broke the canyon's silence. Karen felt the isolation and solitude of Lost Mule Canyon like never before. She refused to acknowledge the sense of peace that enveloped her, along with her own discontent. What would it be like to succumb to the canyon's enchantments? Karen pushed the thought aside, allowing it to germinate subconsciously and overwhelm her someday. The trail meandered along the creek, weaving through a maze of boulders, passing under the shade of cottonwoods and crossing sun-dappled patches of sand. Karen's steps became slower, and regret consumed her. She had overstayed her visit to the West and couldn't linger there indefinitely. Yet despite her misgivings, Karen was surprised that she had not tired of Lost Mule. She knew that her long-delayed visit to Tristan's farm would result in her talking to him about his work. In a way that was not quite clear to her, Karen regretted the necessity of it. Karen found it hard to disapprove of Tristan, despite faint feelings of doubt and uncertainty. She tried to ignore them, but they persisted. As she walked through the forest, she caught glimpses of sunlight filtering through the trees, and soon she saw a clearing up ahead. She hoped to find Tristan there, working on his farm. But what she found was not what she expected. The clearing was filled with an old shack, irregular fences made of all kinds of poles, and plots of bare yellow ground. Dead trees stood in the lots, ringed at the base to kill them and prevent their foliage from shading the soil. Karen saw a long pile of rocks that had been carried from the plowed ground. There was no neatness or regularity to the space, but it was clear that someone had put in a lot of hard work. Karen tried to convince herself that this must be the plot of ground belonging to the herder Charlie. She was about to turn back when she spotted Tristan up ahead. He was planting something in the yellow soil, stalking along and bending down with every step. Karen watched him curiously, feeling a painful swell in her heart. But she pushed those feelings aside and focused on Tristan's vigor and earnestness. He was as dedicated to his work as any rustic farmer she had ever seen. He may not have been succeeding, but he was certainly putting in the effort. He once told her that a man should not be judged by his results, but by his determination. A man could try his hardest and still fail. Karen watched him as he walked and worked, completely absorbed in his task, ignoring the scorching sun. He seemed detached from the life he used to live, the life she longed to bring him back to. Suddenly a strange thought entered her mind. How could she dare to want to take him back? She was taken aback by her own thoughts, as if a stranger had invaded her mind. What was causing her eyes to water and her body to shake? She felt more than she could handle. She fought against her own emotions. Her old self, the Karen Oakman she used to be, despised Tristan Mitterwald's life and work. But the rebellious Karen, the one she couldn't explain, loved him all the more for it. Karen took a deep breath before calling out to Tristan. This meeting would be important, and she was unsure of herself. He seemed surprised to hear her voice, dropping his tools and hurrying over to her, kicking up clouds of dust. He leaped over the rough fence and shouted out to her. He looked strong and powerful, yet also thin and strained. Karen realized he hadn't looked like this when she first arrived at Lost Mule. Had she been causing him worry? The thought made her heart ache. Karen happily presented the dinner to Sir Tiller of the Fields, exclaiming, "Look, your dinner, I brought it, and I'm going to share it with you." He responded with an embrace that left her cheek moist with sweat. He smelled of dust and earth, and his body was hot. "I wish this could be true for always," he exclaimed. His words and loving embrace silenced Karen, who tried to smile as she pulled away from him. "It's sure good of you," he said, taking the basket. "I was thinking I'd be finished with work sooner today and was sorry I hadn't made a date with you. Come, we'll find a place to sit." He led her back under the trees to a half-sunny, half-shady bench of rock overhanging the stream. Great pines overshadowed a still, eddying pool. A number of brown butterflies hovered over the water, and small trout floated like spotted feathers just under the surface. Drowsy summer enfolded the sylvan scene. Tristan knelt at the edge of the brook, plunging his hands in, and splashed like a huge dog, bathing his hot face and head. He then turned to Karen with happy words and laughter, wiping himself dry with a large red scarf. Karen was not immune to his virility, and at that moment, no matter what had made him the man he was, she loved it. "I'll sit in the sun," he said, indicating a spot. "When you're hot, you mustn't rest in the shade unless you have a coat or sweater. But you can sit here in the shade." "Tristan, that'll put us too far apart," Karen complained. "I'll sit in the sun with you." The delightful simplicity and happiness of the ensuing hour was something Karen believed she would never forget. "There, we've licked the platter clean," she said. "What starved bears we were." Karen couldn't help but wonder if she would actually enjoy eating once she got home. She used to be so picky and particular. Tristan interrupted her thoughts. "Karen, don't talk about home." She looked at him. "You dear old farmer, I'd love to stay here and just dream forever." Tristan smiled. "But I came on purpose to talk seriously." "Oh, you did? About what?" Karen asked. There was a quick change in Tristan's tone and expression as he responded. "Well, first about your work. I know I hurt your feelings when I wouldn't listen, but I wasn't ready. I just wanted to be happy with you for a while. Don't think I wasn't interested. I was. And now I'm ready to hear all about it, and everything." Karen smiled bravely, knowing she could hide anything that might hurt his feelings. "What are your business relations with Vandermeer?" she asked. "I'm simply working for him," Tristan replied. "My aim is to get an interest in his sheep, and I expect to someday. We have some plans, and one of them is the development of that Deep Lake section. You remember, you were with us. The day Spillbeans spilled you? Yes, I remember. It was a pretty place, Karen replied. She didn't tell him that she had actually purchased the Deep Lake section of 640 acres a month ago. She had instructed Vandermeer to keep the transaction a secret for now. Karen couldn't explain why she did it, but Vandermeer had assured her it was a good investment with little capital. She wanted to be able to give Tristan the ranch site he loved someday. She had come to the conclusion that he would never fully disconnect himself from the West, and as he visited it occasionally, she had already started making plans of her own. She could spend a month in Arizona every now and then. Vandermeer and I will get into cattle raising one day, Tristan continued, and that Deep Lake place is what I want for myself. What work are you doing for Vandermeer? Karen asked. Anything from building fences to cutting timber, Tristan chuckled. I don't have enough experience yet to be a foreman like Lee Stanton. Besides, I have a little business of my own. I invested all my money in that. You mean here, this farm? Karen asked. Yes, and the livestock I'm raising. You see, I have to feed them corn. And believe me, Karen, those cornfields are a lot of work. I can imagine, Karen replied. You look like you've been working hard. Oh, the hard work is done. All I have to do now is plant and keep the weeds out. Tristan, do sheep eat corn? Karen asked. I plant corn to feed my hogs. Hogs? Karen repeated, unclear. Yes, hogs, he said seriously. The first day you visited my cabin, I told you I raised hogs and fried my own ham for your dinner. That's what you invested your money in? Karen asked in disbelief. Yes, and Vandermeer says I've done well. Hogs, Karen exclaimed, shocked. My dear, are you losing your understanding? Tristan retorted. Hogs. I'm in the hog-raising business and quite pleased with my success so far. Karen managed to control her shock and disgust. She laughed and scolded herself for being foolish. The look on Tristan's face was just as surprising as the information he had just given her. He was actually proud of his work and didn't seem to realize that it might be offensive to his fiancée. Tristan, it's so strange, she said, that you, Tristan Mitterwald, would ever get into hogs. It's unbelievable. How in the world did you manage to do it? Karen asked Tristan incredulously. Tristan's face became twisted with anger and frustration. By God, you're being hard on me, he exploded. How did I manage to do it? What other choice did I have? I gave everything I had to fight for my country, and what did I get in return? Nothing. My government, my employers, and the people I fought for all forgot about me. I was left broken and alone with no one to turn to. Tristan continued, his voice rising with emotion. But I refused to give up. I came out west to start a new life away from the indifference of the people who had abandoned me. And you know what saved me? Raising and tending hogs. It gave me a purpose, a reason to keep going. Karen looked at Tristan, ashamed of her earlier words. His face was pale and his eyes were filled with scorn, but she could see the strength and determination in him. She realized then the depth of his struggle and the incredible journey he had been on. I'm sorry, Tristan, she whispered. I had no idea. Tristan's face softened slightly. It's okay, he said. Not everyone can understand what it's like to be forgotten and left behind. But I made it through, and I'm stronger because of it. She began to vaguely understand the depth of her own selfishness and how it had affected her soul. It was a realization that had been lurking in the shadows of her mind for some time, but now it was staring her in the face. She had pretended to sympathize with Tristan and the crippled soldiers, but in reality she had only been a vain and complacent fool. Tristan's words only confirmed what she already knew. Karen, that was coming to you, he said with a heavy sigh. But even as he spoke, she felt an overwhelming desire to throw herself into his arms. I love you more, she cried out, her emotions getting the better of her. But Tristan's response was less than enthusiastic. I guess you do, a little, he said. Karen knew that she represented a different world than Tristan's, with its age-old customs and unalterable ways, but she was willing to try. Let's get back to your work, she said eagerly. Tristan was amused by her sudden change in demeanor. I'll take you to see my hogs, he said, and Karen eagerly accepted the challenge. As they walked arm in arm down the canyon trail, Karen struggled to maintain her composure. She knew that her emotions were strained and intense and that she was far from normal. But she also knew that she had to try for Tristan's sake. For a few moments they were both caught up in the excitement of the moment, but Karen knew that another shock was coming and that her intuition was telling her something she didn't want to hear. The canyon had changed in some inexplicable way, just as she had. The green foliage, amber stream, brown tree trunks, gray rocks, and red walls still held their beauty. The summer drowsiness and loneliness still prevailed. Yet something was different. A sense of hope no longer surrounded her. She had been struck by a blow, the effects of which only time could reveal. Tristan led her to a clearing at the base of the west wall, where a rough fence of poles had been erected against a shelving portion of the cliff. The pen, which was formed by 3 sides of the fence and solid rock on the 4th, housed a large sow and her litter of pigs. Karen climbed onto the fence and sat there while Tristan leaned over the top pole and spoke passionately about a subject dear to his heart. Today, Karen was an inspiring listener, undaunted by the shiny, muddy, and suspicious old sow or the foul-smelling mud that was a foot deep. She watched the rooting and squealing little pigs, amused and interested, as if they were far removed from the vital issue at hand. However, as she laughed and encouraged Tristan to talk, a strange, solemn, and oppressive feeling weighed on her heart. Was it only the beat, beat, beat of her blood? Tristan was telling her about the litter of pigs. There had been 12, but now there were only 9. Mountain lions, bears, coyotes, and wild cats were all possible culprits for the missing pigs. At first I was convinced that one of those pesky critters had been stealing from me, but as I couldn't find any tracks, I knew I had to blame something else. So I kept a close eye during the day and locked the pigs up in the corner at night, where I've built a pen, as you can see. Yesterday I heard squealing, and by golly, I saw an eagle flying away with one of my pigs. I was furious. That grand old bald-headed eagle, the majestic bird you see with America's stars and stripes, had stooped to the level of a coyote. I ran for my rifle and took some quick shots at him as he flew up. I even tried to hit him, but I missed. That old rascal held on to my pig and flew off with it. I watched him fly all the way up to that sharp crag on the rim. "Poor little piggy," Karen exclaimed. "To think that our American emblem, our stately bird of noble warlike appearance, our symbol of solitude, grandeur, and freedom of the heights, is a pig-pen robber. Tristan, I'm beginning to appreciate the many sides of things. Even my rigid narrow-mindedness is susceptible to change. It's never too late to learn. This should apply to the Society for the Preservation of the American Eagle." Tristan led her along the base of the wall to 3 other pens, each with a fat old sow and her litter. Finally, they arrived at the last enclosure, which was not as dirty due to the dry soil. Tristan picked up a little pig and presented it to Karen, who leaned over the fence. It was fairly white and clean, a little pink and fuzzy, and absolutely adorable with its curled tail. "Karen Oakman, hold it in your hands," Tristan commanded. Although the task seemed impossible, Karen was so determined at that moment that she would have attempted anything. "Sure thing, Joyce," Karen replied, extending her bare hands. "Come here, little piggy, I dub thee Pinky." Despite Tristan's disgust, Karen took the pig in her arms and petted it. "Holy cow!" exclaimed Tristan, overjoyed. "I never would have thought it. Karen, I hope you tell your fancy and neat freak Morrison that you held one of my pigs in your gorgeous hands." "Wouldn't it be better if you told him yourself?" Karen asked. "Absolutely," Tristan replied fiercely. This encounter prompted Tristan to tell Karen all about his pig-raising experiences. Despite her initial reluctance, she found herself drawn in by his story. His enthusiasm was contagious, and she couldn't help but be impressed. The Berkshire Razorback pigs were so big and heavy that their bones couldn't support their weight. The Duroc Jerseys, on the other hand, were the best breed for their area because they had stronger bones that could withstand the weight. Tristan talked about his herds of pigs running wild in the canyon below. In the summer they ate vegetation, and in the other seasons they ate acorns, roots, bugs, and grubs. Acorns were especially good for fattening them up. They also ate cedar and juniper berries and piñon nuts. Essentially, they lived off the land at little cost to the owner, except for the losses from predators. Tristan showed Karen how he planned to establish a profitable business by fencing off the side canyons and segregating herds of his pigs, and by growing plenty of corn for winter feed. At the time, there was a thriving market for hogs, and Vandermeer believed this trend would continue in a growing country. In conclusion, Tristan passionately explained how he had taken on the humblest of jobs out of necessity, and how it had revitalized his body and mind, and given him hope for independence and success. After finishing his meal, Tristan excused himself to fix a weak spot in the corral fence. Karen sat silently, lost in thought. She couldn't believe how her previous judgments of Tristan's hog-raising had vanished. Her narrow-mindedness had dissipated, and she now understood him better. She didn't dwell on his sacrifice to his country, but rather on his work. The more she thought about it, the more she realized its significance. For starters, Tristan had worked with his hands, and Karen couldn't help but see the infinite meaning behind it all. Somewhere in the mix, she grasped the notion that man was meant to earn his living through sweat and hard work. But there was more to it than that. Through toil and sweat, friction of the hands, muscle expansion and contraction, acceleration of blood, something great and enduring came to a man. It was both physical and spiritual, and Karen understood why she would naturally lean towards a man who had used his hands, one who exuded strength, red blood, and virility, one who could fight like the progenitors of the race. Any toil that served this end for any man was splendid. It all went back to the survival of the fittest. Suddenly Karen thought of Morrison. He could dance, attend to her every whim, and amuse her, but how would he fare in a moment of peril? She had her doubts. He certainly couldn't have taken down a ruffian like Hayes Ruff. What then was the significance of a man for a woman? Karen's mind wandered back to Tristan. He had found a secret in his pursuit of something through the labor of his hands. All bodily development had to come through exercising one's muscles. The virility of cells in tissue and bone depended on that. The pleasure and reward of athletes in their training was something he had found in his toil. However, once a man learned this secret, the need for work became permanent. Karen wondered if this explained the Persian law that required every man to sweat every day. She tried to imagine Tristan's mindset when he first started working in the West. She refused to let her cowardly sensitiveness get in the way and was determined to get to the root of the matter. Tristan had been crippled, ruined in health, and broken by an inexplicable war. The heartless, callous neglect of the government and public had left him soul-blighted and on the verge of madness. But he had fought for his life with the instinct of a man and for his mind with a noble and unquenchable faith. He had been alone, but had somehow found hope and strength in his painful efforts day by day. Tristan could not have had any illusions. Health, happiness, and success would have seemed impossible to him. His daily task was something he owed himself. Karen couldn't help but shudder at the thought of how she, like everyone else, had failed Tristan. It wasn't just the country that had used and cast him off. She suddenly understood the meaning behind Tristan's strange, cold, scornful, and aloof manner when he encountered young men of his station who had escaped service in the army. To him they were less than nothing. They had become wealthy from their high-paying jobs and had enjoyed the company of women whose loved ones were fighting in the war. If Tristan could endure the hardships of war for the sake of others, he could surely handle the duty of staying true to himself. Karen watched him as he worked tirelessly in his secluded canyon, making his way to his cabin. He had been playing the game, fighting alone just like his fellow unfortunate brothers. To Karen, Tristan Mitterwald was a heroic figure, a battle-scarred warrior like those described by Carlyle. He had emerged victorious from his struggles, rising above his former self. Resurgam, that was his unyielding cry. But who had heard it? Only the solitude of his canyon, the walls that waited, dreamed, and watched, the silent midnight shadows, the blinking stars, the wild creatures of his domain, and the moaning wind in the pines. How close were these things to God? Karen's heart was full to bursting. Her love for Tristan could no longer be contained in a heart that had a dual purpose. She realized that her motives for coming to the West were selfish and unworthy of his love. Only a lifetime of devotion could make up for it. Her blood raced with excitement and passion, but a sudden feeling of dread and impending disaster washed over her. She watched as he finished his task, wiping the sweat from his forehead before striding towards her. He was tall and confident, with a newfound soldierly bearing that caught her attention. His eyes shone with a light that made her heart skip a beat. This was the moment she had been waiting for over 2 months. "Tristan, when are you going back east?" she asked, her voice tense and low. As soon as the words left her lips, she realized that he had been prepared for this question all along. Karen," he replied gently, though his voice rang out, "I am never going back east." She felt a quiver within her, hindering her ability to speak. "Never?" she whispered. "I might go back for a little visit, but I'll never live there again," he explained. "Oh, Tristan!" she gasped, her hands fluttering towards him. The shock was too much to bear. There was no amazement or disbelief, just a slow realization that sent a cold shiver down her spine. "So this is it? The thing that's been strange between us all this time?" she asked. "Yes, I knew, and you never asked me," he replied. "That was it? All this time you knew?" she whispered, her voice husky. "You knew? That I'd never marry you, never live out here?" "Yes, Karen. I knew you'd never be woman enough, American enough to help me rebuild my life out here in the West," he said with a sad and bitter smile. Her heart ached at his words. Shame, wounded pride, and love all battled for control of her emotions. Love won out in the end. "Dearest, I beg of you, don't break my heart," she pleaded. "I love you, Karen," he answered, with piercing eyes on hers. "Then come back with me home," she implored. "No, if you love me, you'll be my wife," he said firmly. "Love you? Tristan, I worship you," she declared, her passion taking over. "I could never live here," Karen exclaimed, shaking her head. "Have you ever read about the woman who said, 'Whither thou goest, there will I go'?" "Don't be harsh," Tristan replied, attempting to calm her. "I never intended for you to come and live in this wilderness with me. I knew you couldn't do it. But love blinded me to what I saw, and I hoped against hope that you had changed. You don't need to spare my feelings. I feel miserable and ashamed. I thought I loved you, but now I realize that I love the crowd, luxury, and fashion. The things I was born into," Karen cried out, her voice full of passion. "You will realize their insufficiency too late," Tristan responded earnestly. "The things you were born to are love, work, children, and happiness." "No, they are all meaningless to me," Karen retorted. "Tristan, it's the end. You're free." "I don't want to be free," Tristan said, trying to reason with her. "Go home and think things over. Remember what the West has given me. I will always love you, and I will be here hoping." "I can't listen to you," Karen said, her voice breaking. "Here's your ring. You're free. Don't stop me. Goodbye, Tristan." With tears in her eyes, Karen turned and ran down the slope toward the trail. She looked back and saw Tristan standing where she had left him, his loneliness already evident. She felt a sob escape her throat. She hated herself for being in such a state of conflict. The decision had been taken from her, but she knew that the inner turmoil would continue. Without daring to glance back, she stumbled forward, breathless and in a hurry. The atmosphere of the canyon had transformed, with the sunlight and shadows taking on a different hue. The towering walls seemed to have eyes that were mercilessly watching her flee. Upon reaching the mouth of West Fork, an almost overpowering force emanated from beneath the majestic pines. An hour later, she bid farewell to Mrs. Vandermeer, who was weeping, the pale-faced Joyce, Lalomi Lodge, the murmuring waterfall, and the eerie solitude of Lost Mule Canyon. Chapter 8